On a bitter December evening in 2024, when the temperature had plummeted to -15 degrees, fate brought together two unlikely individuals on a desolate stretch of highway in Montana. The former president's motorcade had been making its way through the treacherous mountain passes when disaster struck. 3 of the 4 vehicles in the convoy had slid off the ice-covered road, leaving Donald Trump and his security detail stranded in the unforgiving wilderness. As the wind howled through the valley, carrying stinging particles of snow, the situation grew increasingly dire. The Secret Service agents had managed to get everyone into the remaining SUV, but the engine was failing, and their communication devices were barely functioning in the remote location. The nearest town was over 40 miles away, and darkness was falling fast. Unknown to them, help was about to arrive in the most unexpected form. Michael "Big Shaq" Thompson, a local tow truck operator known throughout the region for his legendary rescues in impossible weather conditions, was returning from helping a stranded family when he spotted the hazard lights blinking weakly through the swirling snow. Big Shaq wasn't just any tow truck driver, he was a former Navy SEAL who had found peace in the Montana wilderness after serving 3 tours overseas. Standing at 6'4" and built like a mountain himself, he had earned his nickname not just for his size but for his uncanny ability to remain cool under pressure. That evening, he was driving his custom-modified heavy-duty rescue truck, equipped with everything from industrial winches to emergency medical supplies. As he carefully maneuvered his truck closer to the stranded vehicle, the Secret Service agents initially tensed up, their training kicking in as they formed a protective circle around the former president. But Big Shaq's calm demeanor and professional approach quickly made it clear he was exactly what they needed in this crisis. "Looks like you folks could use a hand," he called out, his voice carrying over the howling wind. The agents exchanged glances, knowing they had limited options. The temperature was still dropping, and their situation was becoming increasingly dangerous. The former president, despite the circumstances, maintained his characteristic confidence, though his face showed signs of concern for his team's safety. What happened next would become the stuff of local legend, shared in diners and truck stops across the state for years to come. Big Shaq assessed the situation with military precision, quickly formulating a plan to not only rescue the stranded convoy but to ensure everyone's safety in the process. He first set up emergency flares and reflectors to prevent any other vehicles from encountering the same fate. Then, using his truck's powerful spotlights, he illuminated the area like daylight, creating a safe zone in the gathering darkness. The Secret Service agents watched with growing respect as Big Shaq methodically prepared his equipment, every movement practiced and purposeful. The former president, who had seen his fair share of challenging situations, found himself impressed by Big Shaq's quiet efficiency. There was something about the way the big man handled himself that commanded respect without demanding it. As Big Shaq worked, he shared his knowledge of the local terrain and weather patterns, explaining how the particular combination of conditions had created this perfect storm of danger. The rescue operation was like a carefully choreographed dance. Big Shaq's experience with both military operations and winter rescues proved invaluable as he coordinated with the Secret Service team. He showed them how to secure the recovery lines properly and positioned everyone strategically to maintain both security and safety during the operation. What made this rescue particularly challenging was the combination of the sensitive nature of the situation and the increasingly severe weather conditions. The wind chill had dropped to dangerous levels, and the visibility was deteriorating by the minute. But Big Shaq remained unflappable, his calm confidence spreading to everyone around him. The first priority was getting the former president and his team into the heated cab of Big Shaq's truck. The space was tight with so many people, but it was far safer than remaining in the failing SUV. As they huddled in the warmth, Big Shaq shared stories of other rescues he'd performed in these mountains, his deep voice somehow making everyone feel more at ease despite their predicament. The next step would be recovering the vehicles, but that would have to wait until they got everyone to safety. Big Shaq knew these mountains like the back of his hand, and he was already planning the safest route to the nearest secure location. As he prepared to move out, he couldn't help but think about how this night would become one of his most memorable rescues, though not for the reasons anyone might expect. This was just the beginning of a night that would test everyone's limits and forge unexpected bonds between the most unlikely of companions. As Big Shaq's truck began its careful journey through the storm, none of them could have predicted how this situation would unfold, or the lasting impact it would have on all their lives. The journey through the Montana wilderness proved to be more challenging than anyone had anticipated. Big Shaq's heavy-duty rescue truck, despite its impressive modifications, struggled against the intensifying snowstorm. The windshield wipers worked overtime, fighting a losing battle against the relentless snow, while chains on the tires crunched against the ice-covered road. Inside the truck's cab, an unusual scene was unfolding. The former president sat in the passenger seat, his signature suit jacket draped over one of his shivering security team members in the back. Big Shaq had cranked up the heat, but the bitter cold still seeped through the metal frame of the vehicle. The conversation that developed during their slow progress through the storm would later be remembered as one of the most remarkable aspects of this extraordinary night. Used to run rescue operations like this back in '98, Big Shaq mentioned casually, his eyes never leaving the treacherous road ahead. Though back then, it was usually lost hikers or stuck logging trucks. His hands moved with practiced ease over the wheel, making minute adjustments to keep them from sliding on the black ice that lay hidden beneath the fresh snow. The former president, known for his business acumen, found himself genuinely interested in Big Shaq's story. "You've built quite an operation here," he observed, noting the sophisticated equipment that filled the truck's interior. The cab was like a command center on wheels, with multiple radio systems, weather monitoring equipment, and emergency medical supplies all within arm's reach. As they crawled through the whiteout conditions, Big Shaq shared more about his journey from military service to mountain rescuer. He explained how he'd used his military pension to buy his first tow truck, gradually building his reputation in the community. "People thought I was crazy at first," he chuckled, the sound warm and genuine. "Who'd want to spend their days pulling folks out of snowbanks? But every person we help is someone's family member trying to get home." The Secret Service agents in the back, professional as ever, remained alert but couldn't help being drawn into the conversation. One of them, who had served in the Marines, found common ground with Big Shaq, and they briefly exchanged experiences about their service days. The shared stories helped keep everyone's minds off the dangerous conditions outside. Suddenly, the truck's emergency radio crackled to life. Through the static, they could make out reports of another vehicle stranded several miles ahead. Big Shaq's expression grew serious as he listened to the coordinates. The location was right along their planned route to safety, and from the sound of it, the situation was dire, a family with young children. Without hesitation, Big Shaq turned to the Secret Service team. "We've got a choice to make," he said firmly. "We can take a longer route around, or we can stop to help. That family's got maybe an hour in this cold before things get real bad." The agents exchanged glances, their training conflicting with their humanity. The former president, however, didn't hesitate. "We help them," Trump declared, surprising some of his security detail. "I've seen enough of your work tonight to trust your judgment, Big Shaq." The decision would later be cited as one of the key moments that transformed this incident from a simple rescue into a story of human compassion and unity. The next 20 minutes were tense as Big Shaq navigated through nearly invisible roads, using his knowledge of the terrain more than his eyes. The truck's powerful lights cut through the darkness, finally revealing a minivan half buried in a snowdrift. Inside were a mother and her 3 children, their vacation to visit relatives having turned into a nightmare. The rescue operation that followed showcased Big Shaq's expertise in crisis management. He coordinated with the Secret Service team seamlessly, teaching them his techniques for safe extraction in extreme weather. The former president himself helped by talking to the children, keeping them calm as they were carefully transferred to the warmth of the rescue truck. The mother was initially speechless when she realized who else was in the rescue vehicle, but the surreal nature of the situation was overshadowed by the immediate need to warm up her family. Big Shaq had emergency blankets and hot chocolate ready, demonstrating the kind of preparation that had made him legendary in these parts. With the additional passengers, the truck's cab was now quite crowded, but no one complained. The children's presence somehow made the situation less tense, their innocent questions and occasional giggles providing a strange sense of normalcy to an absolutely abnormal situation. The former president found himself sharing stories about his own children growing up, while Big Shaq kept everyone's spirits up with tales of his more unusual rescues. As they continued their journey, the storm showed no signs of letting up. If anything, the weather was getting worse. Big Shaq's weather monitoring equipment showed dangerous temperature drops and wind speeds approaching blizzard conditions. He knew they needed to reach shelter soon, but the next safe haven was still miles away. The situation was becoming increasingly serious, and Big Shaq could feel the weight of responsibility on his shoulders. He had 9 lives in his care now, the former president, 4 Secret Service agents, a mother, and 3 children. Each decision he made could mean the difference between safety and disaster. Yet, as he guided his truck through the treacherous mountain passes, he felt a strange sense of purpose. This was exactly what he had trained for, both in the military and in his years of rescue work. Little did they know that the next hour would test their resilience even further, as nature seemed determined to throw every possible challenge their way. The night was far from over, and the true test of their collective strength was yet to come. The relative calm inside Big Shaq's rescue truck was shattered by a sound that made everyone's blood run cold, the distinctive ping of the engine warning light, followed by an ominous rattling from under the hood. Big Shaq's expression remained steady, but his grip on the steering wheel tightened. After 20 years of rescue operations, he knew exactly what that sound meant. "We've got ice building up in the engine," he announced, his voice calm but serious. "The extreme cold is starting to affect the antifreeze." He glanced at his dashboard thermometer, which now read -25 degrees. The situation had just become significantly more complicated. The former president leaned forward, his years of dealing with crises evident in his composed demeanor. "What are our options?" he asked, directly addressing Big Shaq. The Secret Service agents in the back tensed, knowing that any situation that concerned their experienced rescuer was cause for serious worry. Big Shaq quickly ran through their situation in his mind. They were still about 15 miles from the nearest town, Cedar Ridge, where he knew there was a secure facility that could safely house everyone. But with the engine struggling and the storm intensifying, those 15 miles might as well have been 100. "There's an old ranger station about 2 miles ahead," Big Shaq explained, his mind already formulating a plan. "It's not much, but it's got a wood stove and emergency supplies. We might need to hold up there until either the storm passes or we can get the engine warmed up enough to continue." The mother in the back, who had been quietly comforting her children, spoke up. "Will we be safe there?" Her youngest child was now sleeping against her shoulder, exhausted from the ordeal, while the other 2 kids were unusually quiet, sensing the gravity of the situation. "Ma'am," Big Shaq replied with a gentle smile visible in his rearview mirror, "that station has weathered worse storms than this one. It's built like a bunker, and I keep it stocked myself. Trust me, we'll be just fine." The next 2 miles were among the most tense of the journey. The engine's rattling grew worse, and the truck's speed dropped to a crawl. Big Shaq had to use every bit of his experience to keep the massive vehicle moving forward through the deepening snow. The former president, who had faced countless challenging situations throughout his career, found himself impressed by Big Shaq's unwavering focus and calm professionalism. Finally, through the swirling snow, a dark shape emerged, the ranger station. It was a sturdy log structure, built to withstand the harshest Montana winters. Big Shaq had to make 3 attempts to get the truck up the slight incline to the station, the wheels spinning on the ice before finally finding purchase. The next challenge was getting everyone safely inside. The wind had picked up considerably, turning the short walk from the truck to the station into a dangerous endeavor. Big Shaq organized them into groups, first the mother and children, escorted by 2 Secret Service agents, then the former president with the remaining agents, and finally himself, carrying essential supplies from the truck. Inside, the station was cold but solid. Big Shaq immediately went to work on the wood stove, his movements quick and efficient. He had indeed kept the place well stocked. There were emergency lanterns, blankets, non-perishable food, and even some board games for the children. Within minutes, the first flames were flickering in the stove, promising warmth to come. The former president watched as Big Shaq transformed the space into a functional shelter. "You've done this before," he observed, helping to arrange blankets that one of the agents had brought in. "More times than I can count," Big Shaq replied, now checking their emergency radio for any signals. "Every winter, these mountains remind us that Mother Nature's still in charge. Best we can do is be prepared and help each other out." As warmth slowly filled the station, an unusual scene developed. The Secret Service agents maintained their vigilance but had adapted to the situation, helping to make everyone comfortable while keeping watch at the windows. The children, recovering from their initial fear, began to show curiosity about their surroundings. The oldest child, a girl of about 12, was particularly fascinated by Big Shaq's rescue equipment. "How do you know where to find people in the snow?" she asked, watching as he checked various gauges and monitors he'd brought in from the truck. Big Shaq took a moment to explain his equipment to her, showing her how the different instruments worked. The former president found himself drawn into the impromptu lesson, genuinely interested in the technical aspects of mountain rescue operations. As the evening wore on, Big Shaq prepared some emergency rations, nothing fancy, but hot soup and energy bars were welcome in their situation. The former president insisted on helping distribute the food, creating a surprisingly normal moment in an extraordinary situation. They ate together, sharing stories and finding unexpected common ground despite their vastly different backgrounds. However, Big Shaq's attention kept returning to his weather monitoring equipment. The readings weren't encouraging, the storm was intensifying, and the temperature was still dropping. He knew they were safe in the station, but he also knew they couldn't stay there indefinitely. The Secret Service team needed to get the former president to a more secure location, and the mother and children needed to reach their family. What concerned him most was that his attempts to radio for assistance had been met with static. The storm was interfering with communications, and they were effectively on their own. As he watched the others trying to make the best of their situation, Big Shaq began formulating a plan. He would need to check the truck's engine once it had a chance to warm up, but he also knew that the next phase of their journey would be the most challenging yet. The night was far from over, and as the wind howled outside the station's sturdy walls, Big Shaq knew that their real test of endurance and ingenuity was just beginning. The next few hours would require every bit of his experience and skill to ensure everyone's safety. Around midnight, after 2 hours in the ranger station, Big Shaq decided it was time to check on the truck. The wind had died down slightly, though the temperature continued to plummet. He pulled on his heavy-duty winter gear and headed out into the darkness, accompanied by one of the Secret Service agents who insisted on helping. The truck's engine had cooled completely, which was both good and bad news. Good because it gave them a chance to assess the damage properly, bad because starting it again in these temperatures would be a significant challenge. Big Shaq's LED work light illuminated the engine compartment as he and the agent, who introduced himself as Rick, began their inspection. "I've got good news and bad news," Big Shaq announced after a thorough check. "Good news is the engine block isn't cracked. Bad news is we've got ice in places it shouldn't be." He pointed out the frozen sections to Rick, who had some mechanical experience from his military days. Inside the station, the former president was having an unexpected heart-to-heart with the mother, whose name was Beth. She'd just finished telling him about her job as a high school science teacher and her struggle to make ends meet as a single parent. The conversation had shifted his perspective in a way that would later influence some of his public statements about education funding. The children had finally fallen asleep, wrapped in emergency blankets near the wood stove. The remaining Secret Service agents maintained their watch while trying to establish communication with their backup teams, though the storm continued to interfere with their signals. When Big Shaq and Rick returned, their faces reddened from the cold. Everyone looked up expectantly. "We can fix it," Big Shaq announced, brushing snow from his jacket. "But it's going to take some time and creativity." He laid out his plan to the group, his voice steady and confident despite the challenges ahead. The process would involve using the wood stove to heat water, which they would carefully transfer to thaw crucial engine components. They would also need to create a makeshift shelter around the truck's engine using emergency blankets and tarps to contain the heat. It was a risky plan, but it was their best option. "The real challenge," Big Shaq explained, "will be keeping the engine from refreezing once we get it started. We'll need to maintain constant heat until we reach Cedar Ridge." He turned to the former president and the Secret Service team. "I won't sugarcoat it, this is going to be dangerous. But staying here much longer isn't an option either. The storm's supposed to get worse before it gets better." The former president stood up, his decision made. "I've learned to trust your judgment, Big Shaq. What do you need from us?" This simple statement of confidence had an immediate effect on the group's morale. Even the Secret Service agents, trained to be skeptical of civilians taking charge in crisis situations, had come to respect Big Shaq's expertise. What followed was a carefully orchestrated operation that showcased the best of everyone's abilities. The Secret Service agents proved to be quick learners, following Big Shaq's instructions with military precision. Beth, the science teacher, offered valuable insights about heat transfer that helped refine their approach. Even the former president insisted on helping, holding tools and passing heated water containers despite his agents' initial protests. The children woke up during the commotion and watched in fascination as the adults worked together. The oldest girl, showing the same curiosity she had earlier, asked thoughtful questions about the process. Big Shaq took the time to explain what they were doing, turning the crisis into an impromptu learning opportunity. "See how we're creating a contained space around the engine," he explained, pointing to their makeshift shelter. "It's like building a tiny greenhouse. The heat gets trapped inside, helping thaw out the frozen parts." The girl nodded, clearly filing away this information for future reference. After nearly 2 hours of careful work, the moment of truth arrived. Big Shaq climbed into the driver's seat while everyone else watched anxiously. The engine turned over once, twice, then roared to life. A cheer went up from the group, quickly followed by hurried activity as they prepared to leave before the engine could cool again. Loading everyone back into the truck was actually more challenging than before. The temperature had dropped even further, and the wind had picked up again. Big Shaq organized them into a human chain, ensuring everyone made it safely from the station to the truck. The children were wrapped in multiple layers of blankets, their excitement about the adventure finally returning now that the truck was running. Inside the cab, Big Shaq did a final check of his instruments. The engine temperature was good, but they weren't out of danger yet. The next part of their journey would take them through the most exposed section of the mountain pass, where the wind would be at its strongest. "Everyone buckled in?" he asked, looking back at his passengers. The former president sat in his usual spot in the front, while the others were arranged in the back, sharing blankets and body heat. They had loaded extra firewood and supplies from the ranger station, knowing they might need them before the night was over. As they pulled away from the station, Big Shaq could feel the truck struggling against the wind. The chains on the tires crunched through the fresh snow, and the engine worked harder than usual. But the vehicle was moving, and that was what mattered. The former president watched the station disappear into the swirling snow behind them. "You know," he said thoughtfully, "there's something almost poetic about all this. People from completely different walks of life, working together to overcome a crisis. He glanced at Big Shaq. Someone should tell this story someday. Big Shaq smiled slightly but kept his eyes on the road. Night's not over yet, Mr. President. We've still got about 10 miles of the worst terrain ahead of us. He checked his gauges again, monitoring the engine temperature carefully. But I've got a feeling we're going to make it. Something tells me this group isn't the type to give up easily. As they pressed on into the storm, none of them could have predicted the final challenges that lay ahead. The night had already tested their resilience, ingenuity, and ability to work together, but Mother Nature had one more surprise in store for them, one that would push even Big Shaq's considerable skills to their absolute limit. The relative quiet inside the truck was broken by a sound that made Big Shaq's heart skip a beat, the distinct rumble of snow movement in the distance. Having spent years in these mountains, he knew exactly what that sound meant. An avalanche was forming somewhere above them, triggered by the combination of fresh snow and intense wind. "Everyone stay calm," he announced, his voice carrying the weight of experience. "We're going to need to make a slight change of plans." The former president, who had been dozing lightly, was immediately alert. The Secret Service agents in the back tensed, their training kicking in as they sensed the increased danger. Big Shaq knew their original route through the pass was now too risky. The alternative route would add nearly an hour to their journey, but it would keep them away from the most dangerous avalanche zones. As he carefully turned the truck onto a smaller access road, he explained his decision to the group. "There's an old mining road that runs parallel to the main pass," he said, his eyes scanning the darkness ahead. "It's rougher terrain, but it's sheltered by the tree line. We'll be safer there." The truck's powerful lights cut through the darkness, illuminating the narrow path ahead. Beth, who had been quietly observing the surrounding landscape through the window, suddenly pointed to something in the distance. "What's that light?" she asked. Through the swirling snow, a faint glow was visible, seemingly floating in the darkness. Big Shaq squinted, then his expression changed to one of concern. "That's another vehicle's hazard lights. Someone else is stuck out here." He checked his gauges. The engine temperature was holding steady, but they were running lower on fuel than he'd like. Still, he knew he couldn't ignore someone else in trouble. The former president spoke up before anyone else could. "We have to help them," he said firmly, echoing his earlier decision at the ranger station. The Secret Service agents exchanged glances, their duty to protect conflicting with their human instinct to assist. As they carefully approached the stranded vehicle, they found an elderly couple in a pickup truck that had slid off the road. The man, well into his 70s, had been trying to get his wife to urgent medical care in Cedar Ridge. She was diabetic, and their local clinic had lost power in the storm. Big Shaq quickly assessed the situation. The couple's truck was beyond recovery, stuck firmly in a snowbank, but the immediate concern was the wife's medical condition. She needed her insulin, and the cold was making her condition worse. "Ma'am," Big Shaq said gently, kneeling next to their truck window, "we're going to get you out of here." He turned to the Secret Service team. "I need 3 volunteers to help with the transfer. We've got to do this quickly and carefully." The rescue operation that followed demonstrated why Big Shaq had earned his reputation. He coordinated the evacuation with military precision, ensuring the elderly woman was transferred to his truck with minimal exposure to the cold. The husband, initially overwhelmed by the discovery of who else was in the rescue vehicle, could only express his gratitude repeatedly. Now with 11 people in the truck, space was tighter than ever. But something remarkable was happening inside that crowded cab. The former president gave up his seat to the elderly woman, choosing to sit in the back with everyone else. The children, sensing the seriousness of the situation, offered their blankets to the newcomers. Even the Secret Service agents adjusted their positions to accommodate everyone more comfortably. As they continued their journey along the mining road, the elderly woman, whose name was Dorothy, began to tell stories about her 50 years living in these mountains. She spoke about other fierce storms she'd weathered, about the changes she'd seen in the landscape, and about the way the community had always come together in times of crisis. The former president listened intently, occasionally asking questions that showed genuine interest. This was a side of America he rarely got to see up close, the real people who lived in these remote areas, their challenges, their resilience, and their unwavering spirit of community. Big Shaq maintained his focus on the treacherous road, but he couldn't help smiling slightly at the conversations happening behind him. Here, in the middle of one of the worst storms he'd ever seen, was a group of people from vastly different backgrounds, sharing stories and helping each other survive. The mining road proved to be as challenging as Big Shaq had expected. The truck's suspension creaked as they navigated around abandoned mining equipment and through deep snowdrifts. Every few minutes, he had to stop to check their position on his GPS, making sure they were still on the right track. The children, who had been remarkably brave throughout the ordeal, had started asking Dorothy questions about her life in the mountains. She responded with gentle patience, turning what could have been a frightening situation into something more like an adventure story. However, their progress was suddenly interrupted by an ominous sound from the engine. The temperature gauge, which had been holding steady, began to climb rapidly. Big Shaq knew they couldn't risk another breakdown, not with so many lives depending on them. "We've got about 3 miles left," he announced, studying his instruments. "But we're going to have to push the engine harder than I'd like. Everyone, hold on tight. This might get a bit rough." The former president, who had faced many critical moments in his life, recognized the gravity in Big Shaq's voice. "Whatever you need to do," he said, speaking for the group. "We trust you." Those words carried extra weight coming from someone who had held the highest office in the land. But at that moment, titles and positions meant nothing. They were just people trying to survive together, putting their faith in a man who had dedicated his life to saving others. As the truck pressed on through the storm, its engine straining against the elements, Big Shaq knew the next few minutes would determine whether they all made it to safety or became another story of tragedy in these unforgiving mountains. The night had already been full of challenges, but the final test of their collective resilience was still to come. The next 3 miles became an intense battle against both nature and mechanical limitations. The truck's engine temperature continued to rise, forcing Big Shaq to perform a delicate balancing act between maintaining enough speed to prevent getting stuck and avoiding complete engine failure. The sound of the straining motor filled the cab, accompanied by the howling wind outside. "How bad is it?" the former president asked quietly, noticing the way Big Shaq's eyes kept darting to the temperature gauge. The rescue veteran took a moment before responding, knowing that honesty was crucial but not wanting to frighten the children or worry Dorothy, who was already dealing with her medical situation. "We're running hot," Big Shaq replied, his voice low but steady. "The engine's working harder than it should because of the extra weight and the grade of this road. But we've got something working in our favor, we're starting to descend. Gravity will help us if we need it." The Secret Service agents in the back had been monitoring their location on their own devices, which were finally getting weak but usable signals. They confirmed what Big Shaq already knew: Cedar Ridge was just ahead, but the approaching town brought its own challenges. The steep descent into the valley would put additional strain on the already struggling engine. Beth, drawing on her science teacher background, had been explaining to her children why the truck was having difficulties, turning the crisis into an impromptu physics lesson. "Remember what we learned about friction and heat?" she asked them softly. "That's what's happening right now with the engine." Her calm teaching voice helped keep the children engaged and distracted from the danger. Dorothy's husband, Tom, had been holding his wife's hand throughout the journey, monitoring her condition. Despite the cold and stress, she was holding up well, her spirit buoyed by the unexpected companionship of their fellow travelers. The former president had been particularly attentive, sharing stories about his own parents and showing a warmth that surprised even his Secret Service detail. Suddenly, the truck's engine made a sound that made everyone fall silent, a sharp, metallic ping followed by a decrease in power. Big Shaq's hands tightened on the wheel as he quickly assessed their options. They were now on the steepest part of the descent, with Cedar Ridge's lights visible in the distance through the swirling snow. "Everyone, listen carefully," Big Shaq announced, his voice calm but authoritative. "We're going to lose engine power soon, but we're going to use gravity to our advantage. I need everyone to stay absolutely still and remain calm. We're going to coast down this slope." The former president, recognizing the gravity of the situation, helped ensure everyone was securely fastened in their seats. The Secret Service agents positioned themselves to protect their charge while also helping secure the children and Dorothy. What happened next was a masterclass in crisis management. Big Shaq used every bit of his experience to guide the failing truck down the mountain road. He carefully managed their descent using the emergency brake when needed, reading the terrain through his headlights and anticipating each turn before they reached it. The children, surprisingly, remained calm throughout the ordeal. The oldest girl even started timing the intervals between turns, treating it like a science experiment just as Beth had encouraged them to do earlier. Her analytical approach helped keep her younger siblings distracted from the danger. About halfway down the slope, they encountered another challenge. A fallen tree, likely brought down by the weight of the snow, partially blocked their path. With no engine power to help navigate around it, Big Shaq would have to rely purely on momentum and steering skill to thread the narrow gap that remained. "Everyone brace yourselves," he called out, calculating the approach in his mind. The truck's headlights illuminated the obstacle, casting long shadows across the snow-covered road. Using the vehicle's weight and the slope's angle, Big Shaq executed a perfect drift that carried them through the gap with inches to spare. The former president, who had experienced many tense moments in his life, found himself genuinely impressed. "That was something else," he said, breaking the tension in the cab. "They don't teach that in business school." The moment of levity was welcome, but Big Shaq remained focused. They still had about a mile to go, and while the lights of Cedar Ridge were getting closer, the road conditions were deteriorating. The recent snowfall had hidden patches of black ice, making their controlled descent even more challenging. Dorothy, despite her medical condition, had been silently praying for everyone's safety. Now she reached forward and placed a gentle hand on Big Shaq's shoulder. "Young man," she said, her voice filled with quiet confidence, "I've lived in these mountains for 50 years. I know skill when I see it. You're going to get us there." Her words seemed to fill the cab with renewed hope. Even the Secret Service agents, trained to expect and plan for the worst, found themselves sharing her confidence in Big Shaq's abilities. The former president nodded in agreement, having witnessed firsthand throughout the night how this remarkable man handled crisis after crisis. As they approached the final stretch, Big Shaq began to see familiar landmarks through the snow. The old Miller barn, the curve by Thompson's Creek, the giant pine tree that marked the beginning of town property, all signposts that told him they were almost there. But the night had one final challenge in store for them. The last quarter mile into Cedar Ridge was the steepest section yet, and without engine power, controlling their descent would be the ultimate test of Big Shaq's skills. He knew that one wrong move, one miscalculation, could undo everything they'd accomplished so far. The truck's momentum was building as they started down the final slope, the weight of 11 passengers adding to their speed. Big Shaq could feel every bump and shift in the road through the steering wheel, his senses hyper-focused on maintaining control. The children had fallen silent again, instinctively understanding the importance of this final moment. As Cedar Ridge grew larger in their view, everyone in the truck held their breath, knowing they were about to face the most crucial moments of their entire journey. The night's adventures had forged an unlikely bond between them all, but the final chapter of their story was yet to be written. The final descent into Cedar Ridge became a masterclass in precision and nerve. Big Shaq's hands moved constantly between the steering wheel and the emergency brake, finding the perfect balance between speed and control. The truck's weight worked both for and against them, providing momentum but making it harder to control their descent down the steep, icy road. "There's the emergency depot," Big Shaq announced, spotting the building through the swirling snow. The depot was a sturdy concrete structure at the edge of town, specifically designed to handle crisis situations. It had medical facilities, backup generators, and secure communications, everything they needed. But reaching it meant navigating the trickiest part of their descent. The road curved sharply to the right before straightening out for the final approach. Without engine power, they would have to rely on momentum and precise steering to make it around that curve. "Everyone lean right when I say," Big Shaq instructed, his voice steady despite the tension. The former president immediately understood the physics at play and helped coordinate the passengers in the back. The Secret Service agents positioned themselves to protect both their charge and the civilians. As they approached the curve, Big Shaq watched for his marker, an old oak tree that had stood sentinel over Cedar Ridge for more than a century. When the tree's massive trunk appeared in his headlights, he made his call. "Now!" The synchronized movement of 11 people leaning right helped the truck navigate the curve with remarkable precision. The children, caught up in the moment, couldn't help but cheer as they felt the vehicle respond to their collective effort. But their celebration was premature. As they straightened out for the final stretch, Big Shaq spotted a new obstacle. The recent snowfall had created a massive drift across the road, right in their path. With no engine power to punch through it, they risked getting stuck mere yards from safety. "Hold tight," Big Shaq called out, making a split-second decision. He turned the truck slightly, aiming for the narrowest part of the drift where the wind had packed the snow most densely. It was their best chance of breaking through. The impact was jarring but controlled. Snow sprayed up over the hood, temporarily blinding them, but Big Shaq had judged it perfectly. The truck's momentum and weight carried them through the drift, and suddenly they were through, the emergency depot's lights shining brightly ahead of them. The former president, who had seen his share of critical moments, found himself holding his breath. Dorothy's husband Tom had wrapped his arm protectively around his wife, while Beth held her children close. The Secret Service agents remained vigilant but couldn't hide their relief as the depot grew closer. Big Shaq guided the coasting truck into the depot's covered entrance just as the last of their momentum was running out. The vehicle came to a perfect stop under the bright security lights, ending their harrowing journey with remarkable precision. For a moment, nobody moved. The sudden silence after hours of engine noise and howling wind was almost shocking. Then, from the back seat, one of the children started to laugh, not from fear or nervousness, but from pure joy at having made it. The laughter proved contagious, and soon the entire cab was filled with the sound of relief and celebration. The depot's emergency response team, alerted by the Secret Service agent signals as they approached, was already rushing out to meet them. Medical personnel immediately attended to Dorothy, while others helped the rest of the group inside the warm building. As they entered the depot's main room, the full impact of what they'd just accomplished began to sink in. They had survived one of the worst storms in recent memory, overcome multiple life-threatening challenges, and helped several others along the way. But more than that, they had done it together, setting aside their differences and working as one. The former president, once safely inside, turned to Big Shaq with genuine admiration. "I've met a lot of extraordinary people in my life," he said, extending his hand, "but what you did tonight, that was something else entirely." Big Shaq accepted the handshake with characteristic humility. "Just doing my job, sir. Besides, we all played our part tonight. Every single person in that truck contributed to getting us here safely." Dorothy, now receiving proper medical attention, called Big Shaq over to her side. "Young man," she said, taking his hand in both of hers, "you didn't just save us tonight. You showed us something important, that when times are tough, we're all just people helping people." The children, wrapped in fresh blankets and sipping hot chocolate provided by the depot staff, were already treating Big Shaq like a hero. The oldest girl had started writing down everything she remembered about the journey, determined to share their adventure with her class. Beth, watching her children's excitement, approached Big Shaq with tears in her eyes. "How do you thank someone for saving your family?" she asked softly. "What you did tonight. I'll never forget it." The Secret Service agents, typically stoic and professional, made a point of personally thanking Big Shaq. They had seen countless security operations, but this night had shown them something different: the power of trusting local expertise and working together across traditional boundaries. As the depot's staff bustled around them, arranging accommodations and communications with worried family members, Big Shaq quietly slipped away to check on his truck. The former president noticed and followed him outside. "You know," the president said, watching Big Shaq examine the now silent engine, "most people would have driven past when they saw our vehicle stranded on that road. But you stopped. And then you stopped again for Beth and her kids, and again for Tom and Dorothy. Why?" Big Shaq straightened up from the engine compartment, considering the question. "In these mountains," he finally replied, "we have a saying: the storm doesn't care who you are. Rich or poor, famous or unknown, when nature throws her worst at you, the only thing that matters is people helping people. That's what community means." The former president nodded thoughtfully, a new understanding in his eyes. As they stood there in the depot's bright lights, the storm still raging beyond the covered entrance, both men knew that this night would stay with them forever, not just as a story of survival, but as a reminder of what people can achieve when they work together, regardless of their backgrounds or beliefs. Inside the depot, the group's story was already spreading, becoming the kind of tale that would be told and retold in Cedar Ridge for generations to come. Not just because it involved a former president, but because it embodied something fundamental about human nature: our capacity to rise above our differences and help each other in times of crisis. The following morning dawned clear and bright over Cedar Ridge, the fierce storm having finally spent its fury. The emergency depot buzzed with activity as news crews began arriving, drawn by the remarkable story of the night's events. But what happened next would prove even more extraordinary than the rescue itself. The former president, after getting some rest and making necessary calls, had spent the early hours of the morning in deep conversation with local officials about the region's emergency response capabilities. The night's experience had opened his eyes to the challenges faced by remote communities, and he was already formulating plans to help. "We need more people like Big Shaq," he declared during an impromptu meeting with Cedar Ridge's mayor. "And we need to make sure they have the resources they need to keep doing this vital work." The mayor, still somewhat starstruck, could only nod in agreement as the former president outlined his vision for improving emergency services in rural areas. Beth's children had become the unofficial historians of their adventure. The oldest girl had completed her written account, complete with detailed descriptions of Big Shaq's rescue techniques and the physics principles involved in their descent into town. Her mother, proud of how her daughter had turned a crisis into a learning opportunity, was already planning to use the experience as a teaching tool in her science classes. Dorothy and Tom had received good news: her medical situation was stable, and the local doctor praised Big Shaq's quick thinking in getting her to treatment when he did. The elderly couple insisted on sharing their own story of life in the mountains with the gathering media, emphasizing how the spirit of community had saved lives that night. The Secret Service agents, normally reluctant to comment on their operations, made an exception this time. In their official report, they specifically commended Big Shaq's expertise and decision-making, noting how his local knowledge and skill had turned what could have been a tragedy into a story of triumph. As morning turned to afternoon, more details of the night's events began to spread. The Rangers had found the stranded vehicles and were working to recover them. The family from the minivan had been reunited with their relatives, who had been sick with worry. Even Big Shaq's rescue truck, after a thorough inspection, was declared reparable, though the engine would need significant work. But the most significant developments were happening quietly, away from the media attention. The former president had pulled Big Shaq aside for a private conversation. "What you did last night," he began, "it wasn't just about saving lives. You showed us something important about America, about who we really are when times get tough." Big Shaq listened respectfully, but with his characteristic humility. "Sir, anyone in these mountains would have done the same. It's just how we live up here." "That's exactly my point," the former president replied. "We've gotten too divided as a country. But last night, in that truck, none of that mattered. We were just people helping people." He paused, then continued with purpose. "I want to help you expand your operation. Not just here, but in other remote areas too. Train more people, get better equipment. What do you think?" Big Shaq considered the offer carefully. "If it means helping more people, I'm in. But it has to stay true to what it's about, neighbors helping neighbors, no matter who they are or what they believe." The former president smiled, extending his hand. "That's exactly what I had in mind." As the day progressed, the depot became a gathering place for the local community. People brought food, offered help, and simply came to show their support. The children had become minor celebrities, excitedly retelling their story to anyone who would listen, with each retelling becoming slightly more dramatic than the last. Beth found herself drawn into conversations about education and emergency preparedness, her perspective as both a teacher and a survivor of the night's events proving valuable. She had already started planning a new unit for her science class about weather, physics, and emergency response, inspired by their experience. Dorothy and Tom, feeling much better after proper medical care, had become the depot's unofficial greeters, sharing their wisdom and experience with visitors. Their story of being rescued resonated deeply with the local community, where many had their own tales of winter survival. The Secret Service agents, preparing for their departure, found themselves reluctant to leave. The night had changed their perspective on rural America and the importance of local knowledge in crisis situations. One of them even approached Big Shaq about providing training sessions for their teams about winter rescue operations. As evening approached again, the former president prepared to finally depart Cedar Ridge. But before leaving, he gathered everyone from the truck journey for a final moment together. Looking at the faces around him, Big Shaq's quiet strength, Beth's resilient spirit, the children's bright eyes, Dorothy and Tom's gentle wisdom, and even his own agent's newfound appreciation for community, he felt compelled to speak. "Last night, in the worst conditions imaginable, we learned something powerful," he said. "We learned that when we strip away all the labels and divisions, we're capable of extraordinary things." Big Shaq didn't see a former president, a teacher, or an elderly couple, he saw people who needed help. "And together, we didn't just survive, we showed what America is really about." The group shared knowing looks, each remembering their own moments from the journey, the fear, the courage, the teamwork, and ultimately, the triumph. They had entered that truck as strangers and emerged as something closer to family. Big Shaq, standing slightly apart as usual, finally spoke up. "The mountains have a way of teaching us what's important," he said simply. "Sometimes it takes a storm to show us how strong we really are, especially when we work together." As the sun set over Cedar Ridge, casting long shadows across the snow-covered landscape, the story of that remarkable night was already becoming legend. But more than just a tale of survival, it had become a reminder of the bonds that connect people in times of crisis, the strength found in unity, and the everyday heroes who ask for nothing in return for their service. The former president's last act before leaving was to take a photo with the entire group, standing in front of Big Shaq's battered but proud rescue truck. That photo would later hang in diners and homes throughout the region, not because it featured a famous politician, but because it captured something genuine about the spirit of community and the power of working together. As Big Shaq watched the presidential convoy finally depart, he already had plans forming in his mind for expanding his rescue operations, training new operators, and strengthening the network of community support that had proven so vital. The storm had changed more than just the landscape, it had shown a path forward, one that emphasized what united people rather than what divided them. The story of that night would be told and retold, growing perhaps in the telling, but its essential truth would remain the same. In the face of nature's fury, it wasn't status or politics that mattered, but the simple act of people helping people, and the remarkable things they could achieve together.